Hi, I'm Krista, and this is my e-learning system that's an introduction to tennis. Just a short description of the course. The course is designed to be an introduction to the sport of tennis. It's really geared towards new players, more like absolute beginners. Focus is on rules and terminology that you need to know. This isn't a course where you're going to learn to hit a killer backhand because those are physical skills. Players will learn those physical skills when they enroll in a beginner tennis clinic. This could, however, be a great supplement to a beginner tennis clinic and would especially be ideal to prepare players for their first match. This is Courtney. She acted as the narrator and teacher, and I created her in Character Animator. I'll be honest, I didn't realize when I started this how much work it was going to be to create an agent, and it was extremely time-consuming. But I think it made a difference and helped make the lesson less intimidating and perhaps even more enjoyable. Plus, it had the added benefit of employing both the personalization and embodiment principles. Moving on to the first learning objective, which is players will be able to recall the names of the parts of the tennis court. The Bloomian is recalling the names of the parts of the tennis court from memory. The knowledge dimension is factual knowledge, which is knowledge of terminology, and the cognitive dimension is remember, recalling. Now I'm going to talk a bit about how I taught this objective. Of my 3 objectives, this one had the lowest level of knowledge. It was basically a matter of memorization. I used graphics to support the narration and sync them up. I also employed other LC methods like signaling to draw attention to the key parts of the lesson, like you can see here with the arrows pointing to the singles lines and doubles lines. For my second learning objective, it was players will be capable of summarizing serving and return of serve. The Bloomian is summarizing the serve and return of serve. Knowledge dimension is factual knowledge, which is knowledge of specific details and elements. The cognitive dimension is understand summarizing. For this learning objective, there was a slight increase in the knowledge level with a bump from remember to understand. The graphics were used to illustrate concepts that would be difficult to understand without visuals, such as in the slide below, which illustrates switching between the add side and do side of the court after a point is played. This slide also reinforces things taught in Objective 1, such as the add side and do side of the court. Now that you know the deuce and add sides of the court, we can learn all about serving and receiving serves. Since serving is the way all points get started, it's obviously a key to the game of tennis. The same player serves for an entire game, and every game begins on the deuce side of the court. The next point is played from the add side, and players continue switching between the deuce and add sides until someone wins the game. The player who is not serving is said to be receiving the serve, and they also alternate sides so that they are in the correct position to hit the serve back and continue the point. Next is the final learning objective, which is that players will be able to play using a standard scoring, including a 10-point tiebreak. The Bloomian is implementing correct scoring during a match. The knowledge dimension is procedural knowledge, which is knowledge of subject-specific skills. And the cognitive dimension is apply, executing. For this final objective, the level of knowledge in the course bumped up from understand to apply. I tried to use graphics to illustrate concepts that are presented by narration. I built upon content learned in the first 2 sections of the course. I used worked examples and fading to help learners master skills for complicated problems. And problems were based on realistic match play scenarios. Next, I'm going to talk about how I incorporated learner-centered design principles into the project, starting with the multimedia principle. I used graphics to support the narration, animation to illustrate procedures, and visual cueing and animations, like I'll show you here. We've covered the boundaries on the sides of the court, but we haven't covered the line that is in the back of the court. This outer line at the back of the court is called the baseline. As you start playing, you'll hear people refer to the baseline often. Next is the contiguity principle. Printed words were located by their corresponding graphics, like you can see in this picture here, where the service boxes are labeled right where the service boxes are on the court. The feedback is provided near the question, as well as narration and graphics are synchronized. There's no scrolling to view content anywhere, and the directions are located near the question. I employed the modality principle by having lessons consist of narration and graphics, and also had an exceptions to the modality principle, which is making some keywords available to the learner that are unfamiliar. And you can see that here where I've labeled the singles lines and doubles lines. For the redundancy principle, I avoided on-screen text when using narration whenever possible. However, there are a few exceptions. As you can see on this slide, I was teaching the names for points in tennis. In this case, there aren't any pictures or supporting graphics that would really convey the message that I'm trying to get across. I did limit it to the minimum amount of words necessary to convey the message in order to limit the amount of reading that the user had to do at the same time they were listening to a narration. In some other slides, I also had to label something important on a graphic, but I believe this also fell under the exception to the redundancy principle. The coherence principle was more about what I didn't do than what I did. I didn't have any decorative images, no background music, no extraneous words such as fun facts, and I included simpler visuals, which included the simplified tennis court and players versus using photos of real players. There were a lot of uses of personalization and embodiment in my learning system. Courtney had a conversational style and spoke with a human voice, which happened to be mine. Obviously, the biggest use of embodiment was the agent herself. While she's a cartoon, I still attempted to add human-like behavior to her. Hi, I'm Courtney, and I'm here to introduce you to the sport of tennis. I'll be your guide through this course. I'm excited to share some of the basics of tennis with you. I incorporated the segmenting principle by breaking down the lessons into manageable segments. The main way I tried to use the engagement principle was to have limited typing and practice questions. For worked examples and fading, I used worked examples for the most difficult problems and used fading to go from a worked example to students doing entire problems themselves. I used explanations if learners got worked examples incorrect in order to get them back onto the right track. The 2 slides show examples of the fading going on. In the first slide, Courtney does part of the work for them, and in the second slide, they're asked to do it on their own. I already talked quite a bit about how I incorporated practice into my e-learning system, but just to recap, I used practice questions to reinforce learning, more practice for difficult concepts and less for simple. Immediate feedback was provided for incorrect answers. The users had to use the feedback to get the correct answer before moving on. The feedback was positioned near the question, and there was no judgmental or overzealous feedback. As far as learner control, learners can control the pacing by pausing and starting slides and reviewing slides. However, learners must watch the entire slide before moving on to the next one. Since they're novices, I decided not to allow skipping, and once the slide is played, they do have control of moving forward. Out of the 15 people that completed the pre-test, went through the entire e-learning course, and then completed the post-test, 7 were new tennis players who had not played their first match yet, and 8 considered themselves unfamiliar with tennis but weren't enrolled in a beginner tennis course. The paired t-test found that the results were significant. The value of negative 7.93 with a p-value of less than 0.05. The pre-test mean was 46.7 with a standard deviation of 13.3, and the post-test mean was 84.3 with a standard deviation of 12.5. I had several ideas for further development. First of all, for content, I would have really liked to have included all the content to make it a complete introduction to the tennis course, but I was limited in time and needed to keep it to 30 minutes. If I were able to add more content, I would have liked to have split that into individual lessons or modules, which could have allowed the learner to spread out learning over time rather than all at once. I envisioned individual lessons for things like parts of the court and scoring, etc. The biggest regret I have is that I used a trial version of Adobe Captivate, and when the project got published, it told me that the files are going to expire on July 3rd. I thought I would still have access to what I had created, just not be able to make changes. So I'm really disappointed that all the work I did is going to disappear in a month. I wish there was a way to do an open-ended question because you need more than multiple choice for higher levels of learning. The test system I used didn't really work well for open-ended questions because they wanted to auto-grade everything, and I can't predict the exact way a learner would respond to an open-ended question. Would also have liked to have been able to integrate pre- and post-test into the e-learning system for a more cohesive experience. Initially, I did have both the pre-test and post-test in the e-learning system in Captivate, but I found out that to report results, it needed to be in an LMS. And since I had a short window to get my learners to test my system, I didn't want them to have to register because I promised they could remain anonymous. So I made the decision to go to an external test website in order to make it easier for the learner to get access to the learning system. Would have liked to integrate a progress indicator so that learners can easily view progress within the lesson. Another improvement would have been better controls. I really wanted a pause-play toggle button instead of 2 separate buttons, but I just couldn't figure it out. I also would like a rewind in addition to the back button, another thing I couldn't figure out. An additional interface improvement would be tracking if a slide has been watched already so that if they go back to that slide, they can watch just part of it instead of the whole thing over again. Thanks for viewing my presentation.